Welcome back, scientists! We are going to continue learning about tide pools this week by learning about a special family of creatures. This family of creatures has soft, squishy bodies with no bones, and they live in shells. These creatures are called mollusks. Some members of the mollusk family have two shells. Those are called a bivalve. Two shells, kind of like the two wheels on a bike. Bicycle, bivalve. Two shells for the bivalve. Some members of the mollusk family only have one shell. Those ones are called a univalve, which is a little bit like a unicycle. One wheel, one shell. So let's get right into our learning about bivalve creatures. Let's start with a mollusk called a mussel. Mussels are bivalve, meaning they have two shells. You can put your two hands together. These shells have a hinge where they hold together and they can open and close. They use special little tiny threads to actually hold themselves onto rocks. These are called byssal threads. So once a mussel finds its spot, it puts those threads down into the rock and then it doesn't move. They grow in groups all together, so you might see a big cluster of these mussels all along the rocks in the tidal zones. Mussels have two siphons. That's kind of a fancy word for tube. So they have one tube right here that goes in, it pulls seawater in, and then it has another tube to spit water out. Now, if you stop and wonder for a minute, why would it want to suck water in? And why would it need to spit some out? Well, when it sucks water in, it's actually sucking in tiny little plants and creatures. In first grade, we call these sea soup, but really the very fancy science words are they suck in zooplankton, which are tiny little animals that fit all in the size of one little drop of water, and phytoplankton, which are very teeny tiny plants. So these are really zoomed in pictures that make them look big, but really all of these zooplankton and phytoplankton would all fit in one little drop of water. So they suck that water in, they eat up the parts they like, and then they use the other siphon or tube to spit back out the extra seawater and any waste. So this picture shows how they can suck the water in with a siphon over here and then spit it out over here. This also shows the threads that are holding it down onto the rock and what's called the foot of the mussel, which to me looks a little bit more like a little tongue or part of a snail, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about that. This zoom in feature shows this tiny little circle. It's like you put it under a big microscope and made it really big, and these are the plankton that live there, zooplankton and phytoplankton. This shows a whole bunch of mussels that all live along the mid-tide zone. They grow in those groups of clusters, and that's so that they can survive all the thrashing waves and the sun and all those things like this sneaky bird that might like to eat him. Another member of the mollusk family is called an oyster. Oysters are also bivalves because they have two shells. They use muscles, just like you have big muscles, to actually hold their shell open or closed. That protects them from being eaten. Oysters have little lines across their shell. This is really zoomed in, and that shows how much the oyster has grown. Kind of stretched and grew and added more lines as it's been around longer. Oysters also grow in clusters that are called oyster beds under the water, which is similar to the mussels we just looked at. They stay in the same spot for their whole lives. An oyster is a little bit different because they use a gill to pull water in, which is just a little bit different than the siphon, but they eat the same thing that the mussel does. They eat zooplankton and phytoplankton, and they filter it through their gills. That's all those tiny little, almost like little fingers or hairs. They clean it out as it comes in, and then they push out any extra seawater or waste that they don't need. Our last bivalve for this week is a clam. Now these ones are a little bit different, and I think you'll notice that the way that they live their lives is just different from the way an oyster or a mussel does, even though they have two shells, just like an oyster or a mussel. So clams also have two shells, which means they're a bivalve. They also have lines that show their growth. This is kind of what the inside of a clam looks like. This is a drawing of it. And they have the siphons, those tubes that pull in water and food and then spit out waste and extra water. They also have this foot, which behaves like a muscle to move them and do some other survival tactics that I'll show you in another video. And inside they have a mouth, and they also have a gill. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But right about this edge is where you can see the shell. So you're almost going to imagine they took off one shell so that we could see inside. This is what the clam's foot looks like when it comes out of its shell. Now, I know a lot of you have been to the beach and picked up clam shells, and sometimes you can even find them closed, and they feel heavy, and you know that something's living in there. But it's not very often that we actually see them above the sand with their foot out. So I'm going to show you some videos that I found to share with you what they use their foot for. So that was a quick run-through of what a mollusk is, that soft-bodied creature that lives in a shell. And we talked about bivalves, oysters, mussels, and clams. So get your writing page that talks about bivalves and tell something cool that you learned about bivalves. And if you have time, click on some of the other videos that show you how those creatures use their foot and their siphons and some other neat things that they can do, even though they're just a soft-bodied little guy in a shell. Click for the next video to learn about univalves.